Hello and welcome to the show. This is the Black Ponderer. I'm the host of the program, Neil Trotter. And today, yes, you've read the title correctly. We're going to be talking about this highly influential, very important work of philosophy, The Phenomenology of Spirit by J.W.F. Hegel. So, in case you don't know, the Phenomenology of Spirit is considered one of the great masterworks of philosophy. Definitely up there with other highly regarded philosophical texts like, Nietzsche's Thus Spoke Zarathustra, Rene Descartes' Discourse on Method, what else, Aristotle's Nicomachean Ethics, Plato's The Republic, those really high up there philosophical texts. This is definitely up there with them. Why? Well, the ideas are pretty profound in this book, but even more so, the reason why the ideas are so profound is because they had so much influential impact. They influenced a lot of the philosophy at that time, kind of changed the course of philosophy and what people thought about philosophical ideas. When it was first published in 1807, it had a huge ripple effect. And even today, contemporary philosophers are still talking about what Hegel discussed in this work, and just Hegel in general. But this is one of his major works. So before we get into the nitty-gritty of what's going on in this book, let's talk about what we're not going to do. Okay, what we're not going to do is we're not going to flex and say, "Ooh, I've read the Phenomenology of Spirit. Aren't I great? This is an incredible feat of reading and focus, and I'm a very intelligent person for reading the Phenomenology of Spirit, and here's how you can do it too, because I know all the secrets and all the techniques." No, we're not going to do that. We're not going to be flexing. We're not going to be talking about how cool it is to read this book just because it's complex, because infamously this work is very dense and it's very complicated. Hegel is not the best writer. In fact, he's actually a pretty bad writer. His philosophy is very good. The ideas are quite rich and quite profound and powerful. It's just his communication skills and his writing skills, not the best, right? Which contributes to his, not only are the ideas complicated, but his communication and writing techniques aren't the best. And that's not the fault of the translator. He just wasn't the best in terms of writing. That's why it's so hard. But we're not going to flex, or we're not going to be like, "Oh, aren't we great for reading the phenomenology?" That's not what we're here for. So the other thing we're not going to do is I'm not going to sit here and be like, so the phenomenology is about the reciprocal relationship between transcendental existential crises in the terms of the endearment of the cryogenic analysis of the superego transposed with the immediate transistor relationship between agony and the movements through time and space, contemporary to the issues of our era, through an ecological, interpersonal, eco-relationship between man, animal, and God. Do you see? Do you understand? No, that's another thing I'm not going to do. I'm not going to throw you all this jargon that Hegel, himself uses, a lot of jargon. We're going to diffuse a lot of that jargon, and I'm going to break it down for the common person, right? For the layman, if you will. The third thing I'm not going to do is I'm not going to give you a cliff notes or a summary or synopsis. I'm not going to be here like, okay, when you finish watching this video, you're going to know everything that there needs to know about that phenomenology of spirit. I'm going to break it down to you in simple, easy to understand terms. Okay, I'm not going to do that either, because that's frankly impossible. That would be like me sitting down and telling you, okay, here's a summary of the Bible, right? Or, okay, that calculus textbook, just sit here for 5 minutes and I'm going to give you a summary of all calculus. You ready? Let me break down quantum mechanics for you. It's easy. It's very simple. No, you can't. Certain things you can't just break down, right? You have to do it. You have to experience them. You have to partake in them. You have to kind of expose yourself to them. The best way to learn about what's happening in this book is to actually read it. And nobody sitting here and telling you about what they think the book is about, or what they think the ideas are, is going to substitute from you actually sitting there and reading the text and learning for yourself. That's still the best way. So I would encourage you to do that. So what are we going to do in this video? Well, what we're going to do, or what I'm going to do, is I'm going to try to break down some of the themes in this book and explain to you why they are important today and how you can use what Hegel's talking about, which was first published in 1807, how you can bring that into the 21st century, right? The year of this video publication is 2021. Is Hegel's idea still applicable to today's world? Absolutely. Can they help you be a better person in the modern era? Absolutely. Can you use what Hegel is saying here in the Phenomenology of Spirit to make the world a better place? I think so. Which is why, in my opinion, this is a masterwork, because it's timeless. It might be complicated, it might be complex and very dense material, but the ideas that are put forth in here are timeless. And you can use these ideas today for yourself, to make yourself a better person and to make the world better. I strongly believe that. That's what we're going to be talking about in this video today. So let's get started. Here at the Black Ponder, if you're new to the show, we actually read quotes that I choose from the text. So we actually read the text, right? And then I add supplementary commentary. And then we go back and forth with that supplementary commentary in the comments below, right? That's how it's an engagement. That's what philosophy is. It's a conversation. It's a dialectic. We'll talk about dialectic because Hegel's all about that. It's a discourse, right? That's what philosophy is. It's a conversation. So I will read you the first quote that I have chosen. It is on page, okay, so if you have this edition, very popular edition, the Tan edition, translated by A.B. Miller. It's Oxford publication, very popular edition of this book. If you have it, I'm going to begin on page 60. This is actually the third paragraph. This is section 97. It is as a universal, too, that we utter what the sensuous content is. What we say is this, i.e. the universal, this, or it is, i.e. being in general. Of course, we do not envisage the universal, this, or being in general. But we utter the universal, in other words, we do not strictly say what, in this sense, certainty we mean to say. But language, as we see, is the mere truthful in it. We ourselves directly refute what we mean to say. And since the universal is the true content of sense certainty, and language expresses this true content alone, it is just not possible for us ever to say or express in words a sensuous being that we mean. So what's being said here? I think what's being said here is that when we talk, we're always talking in universal terms. But in what way? So we're not only talking about our individual self, our distinct self. We always talk in relation to others, or we talk in a mode of interdependence, right? That's what language is. It's not just us talking about ourselves. It's us talking about ourselves in relation to everything else. It's an expression of interdependence. This is what reality is. I put in my notes here, I write down little notes on the margins. True reality is ecology, i.e. interdependence. We're going to talk about that. A theme with the Black Ponder channel. The ultimate reality is ecology. Independence doesn't really exist. Okay? Well, we're going to continue reading. This is page 61, section 99. Pure being remains, therefore, as the essence of this sense certainty, since sense certainty has demonstrated in its own self that the truth of its object is the universal. But this pure being is not an immediacy, but something to which negation and mediation are essential. Consequently, it is not what we mean by being, but is being, defined as an abstraction or as the pure universal in our meaning, for which the true content of sense certainty is not the universal, is all that is left over in face of this empty or indifferent now and here. What's being said here? Let me read you my little notes in the book. Language is an abstraction of reality that eludes of independence. Okay, so when we talk, we think we're talking about ourselves or us as an individual, and we're trying to differentiate ourselves, and we're caught up in this differentiation. The thing is, though, as we're talking, we're actually expressing ourselves in relation to everything else. You know, when I'm talking to you, I'm describing my relationship with you, even though I think that I'm expressing myself as an individual self. Really, I'm expressing myself in relation to you, which means there's a connection. But we oftentimes get tricked. We think that we're distinguishing ourselves or we're separating ourselves. That's not actually what's happening, but we think that's what's happening. But let me continue. I skipped down 3 lines. This is section 100. The object, which was supposed to be the essential element in sense certainty, is now the unessential element. For the universal, which the object has come to be, is no longer what the object was supposed essentially to be for sense certainty. On the contrary, the certainty is now to be found in the opposite element, viz., in knowing which previously was the unessential element. Its truth is in the object as my object, or in its being mine. It is because I know it. Sense certainty, then, though indeed expelled from the object, is not yet thereby overcome, but only driven back into the I. We have now to see what experience shows us about its reality in the I. I'll read you what I wrote down in the margins, my notes to help me understand. This subjective objectification, this false defining via a compulsion to own, creates falsehood. Right? So what I'm saying is when we talk to each other, we think we're distinguishing ourselves as separate or independent from everything else. And this creates a falsehood. This creates a false reality. Right? Because that's not really what's happening. When we're communicating, we're communicating ourselves in relation to everything else. So we're communicating this ecology, this interdependence that we all share. But we're going to get more deeper into that idea. We're on page 64, and this is section 107. This is beginning on the second line here on the page. This is posited, but it is rather an other that is posited, or the this is superseded. And this otherness, or the setting aside of the first, is itself in turn set aside, and so has returned into the first. However, this first, thus reflected into itself, is not exactly the same as it was to begin with, viz., something immediate. On the contrary, it is something that is reflected into itself, or a simple entity, which, in its otherness, remains what it is, a now which is an absolute plurality of nows. That's interesting. Hegel is talking about the other, or otherness. And that's a common thing that's being discussed in today's contemporary current affairs, right? The othering of people. We see that in social justice discourse when we talk about social inequality, which is, hot topic today. It's been around for a while, but there's things like xenophobia, like the fear of the other, right? Fear of immigration or immigrants or refugees. this othering of somebody. But what's actually happening here? It's a delusion, this othering, right? Because these people, these immigrants, these refugees, we're just using that as an example, but it's an important example because it kind of basically describes what Hegel is talking about. We look at other people that are in other situations or circumstances, experiencing things that we ourselves don't experience, and we other them. But in reality, they are us. Hegel uses reflected, right? They are a reflection of us. These people that are othered are a reflection of ourselves, right? But Hegel is talking about what's going on within. Hegel isn't necessarily referring to other people. He's talking about we other ourselves. But what I'm saying is that when we do that, when we other other people, really we are othering ourselves because we don't see the reflection of ourselves from those around us, right? Which is the reality. We don't see that interdependence that we have, that ecology that we all are a part of, and it leads us to a false sense of reality. Let me keep going. This is section 109. We're still on page 64. It is clear that the dialectic of sense certainty is nothing else but the simple history of its movement or of its experience. And sense certainty itself is nothing else but just this history. That is why the natural consciousness, too, is always reaching this result, learning from experience what is true in it. But equally, it is always forgetting it and starting the movement all over again. It is therefore astonishing when, in face of this experience, it is asserted as universal experience and put forward, too, as a philosophical proposition, even as the outcome of skepticism, that the reality or being of external things taken as this is, or sense objects, has absolute truth for consciousness. To make such an assertion is not to know what one is saying. And I'll consult my notes here. We falsely assume our subjective reality is objective truth, right? We only see ourselves as a subject, and we don't see ourselves in relationship with everything else, right? We think that we as a subject is the only truth, but the reality is that our subjectivity is part of an overall reality, an overall existence that has an objective. See what I'm saying? Maybe not, but we'll keep going. We're on page 65 now. We're still on section 109. This is the last sentence of that section. What consciousness will learn from experience in all sense certainty is in truth only what we have seen, viz. The this as a universal, the very opposite of what that assertion affirmed to be a universal experience. Let me read you my notes. The limits of our perception disallows us to know objective reality. We can only know truth subjectively. In this way, there are multiple truths. Ooh. Some people don't think that. Some people are like, look, there's only one truth, and everything else is opinion. That's not exactly true. All right, but we will continue as we continue reading these quotes. I'm just going to keep going where I left off. With this appeal to the universal experience, we may be permitted to anticipate how the case stands in the practical sphere. In this respect, we can tell those who assert the truth and certainty of the reality of sense objects that they should go back to the most elementary school of wisdom. I skip down 3 lines. For he who is initiated into these mysteries not only comes to doubt the being of sensuous things, but to despair of it. In part, he brings about the nothingness of such things himself in his dealings with them, and in part, he sees them reduce themselves to nothingness. Let me read you my notes. To realize that objective truth is impossible can lead us to despair, right? So there is an objective truth, meaning existence, reality in Hegel's mind is going somewhere. There's an objective to it. Right? There's a purpose, there's a point, and we're all part of it. But we don't know that. Limited to our own subjectivity and not being able to comprehend where the overall reality is going can lead us to despair. Right? That's where the problem arises, right? We have to come to terms with that, okay? And so Hegel has a lot to say about that. Coming to terms with understanding that our subjectivity contributes to an overall purpose in reality, that's how we overcome the despair. But here we are on page 66. We begin on the 8th line. If they wanted to say it, then this is impossible because the sensuous, this, that is meant cannot be reached by language, which belongs to consciousness, i.e., to that which is inherently universal. In the actual attempt to say it, it would therefore crumble away. Those who started to describe it would not be able to complete the description, but would be compelled to leave it to others, who would themselves finally have to admit to speaking about something which is not. They certainly mean, then, here, which is quite different from the bit mentioned above. But they say actual things, external or sensuous objects, absolutely singular entities, and so on, i.e., they say of them only what is universal. Reading in my notes, the quote-unquote universal is subjective truth abstracted to the point to be general enough for all to understand. But this abstraction obliterates objective truth even further. What's being said here? To be able to understand how you as an individual relates to overall reality, how what you're doing contributes to what reality is doing, what existence overall is doing, that requires a level of abstraction that is beyond comprehension. And that can overwhelm the mind, it can overwhelm the spirit. How do we deal with this? Well, here's how many people deal with this. Okay, continue reading. This is page 70. This is section 116. This then is how the thing of perception is constituted, and consciousness is determined as percipient insofar as this thing is its object. It has only to take it, to confine itself to a pure apprehension of it, and what is thus yielded is the true. If consciousness itself did anything in taking what is given, it would by such adding or subtraction alter the truth. Since the object is the true and universal, the self-identical, while consciousness is alterable and unessential, it can happen that consciousness apprehends the object incorrectly and deceives itself. The percipient is aware of the possibility of deception, for in the universality, which is the principle, otherness itself is immediately present for him. Though present as what is null and superseded, his criterion of truth is therefore self-identity, and his behavior consists in apprehending the object as self-identical. Since at the same time diversity is explicitly there for him, it is a connection of the diverse movements of his apprehension to one another. But if a dissimilarity makes itself felt in the course of this comparison, then this is not an untruth of the object, for this is the self-identical, but an untruth in perceiving it. So what's being said here? Here's my complementary notes. Our despair in our individuality to know objective truth creates a desire to own truth, i.e., make truth our own via subjective objectification. With statements like, oh, there's only one truth. There's no multiple truth. There's one truth. I know what it is. I own it. Right? Gotta be careful about that. Let me continue my notes here. This subjective reality is a contradiction in the sense that it nullifies truth. Because what you're doing, you're othering things that fall outside of your truth. They're like, oh, that's just opinions that are wrong. And what's happening is that it blocks your understanding of how you relate to everything else. Let me continue. This is page 74, section 122, and this is the last sentence of that section. Our experience then is this, that the thing exhibits itself for the consciousness apprehending it in a specific manner, but is at the same time reflected out of the way in which it presents itself to consciousness and back into itself. In other words, it contains in its own self an opposite truth to that which it has for the apprehending consciousness. And I skip down 6 lines. The thing is a one reflected into itself. It is for itself, but it is also for an other. And, moreover, it is an other on its own account, just because it is for an other. Accordingly, the thing is for itself and also for an other, a being that is doubly differentiated, but also a one. But the oneness contradicts this diversity. So, perception performs a natural othering. We think of ourselves as independent individuals, separate from everything else. We don't fully understand how our individual existence contributes, interrelates with the existence of everybody else or all things, because our perception is limited to our subjectivity. But this is a contradiction of who we are, right? This lack of understanding is a contradiction. Let me continue with some quotes. This is section 128, page 76. The object is in one and the same respect the opposite of itself. It is for itself, so far as it is for another, and it is for another, so far as it is for itself. It is for itself, reflected into itself, a one. But this for itself, this reflection into itself, this being, a one, is posited in a unity with its opposite, with its being for another, and hence only as cancelled. In other words, this being for self is just as unessential as the only aspect that was supposed to be unessential, viz., the relationship to another. What I notated was to be perceived is to contradict your true self. Our perception is a contradiction. Our perception is a deception of who we really are. If that's true, then how can we be acknowledged truthfully, right? How's that possible if we can't perceive our actual selves? Hegel has an answer, but we gotta do the work to figure it out. This is page 77 at the top, section 129. These pure determinatnesses seem to express the essential nature itself, but they are only a being for self that is burdened with a being for another. Since, however, both are essentially in a single unity, what we now have is unconditioned absolute universality. And consciousness here for the first time truly enters the realm of the understanding. Thus, the singular being of sense does indeed vanish in the dialectical movement of immediate certainty and becomes universality, but it is only a sensuous universality. My meaning has vanished and perception takes the object as it is in itself, or as a universal as such. Singular being therefore emerges in the object as true singleness, as the in itself of the one, or as a reflectedness into itself. And so what's happening is it's a sensuous universality, a feeling. This is part of how we get past our limited perception. I know you would say like, well, feeling is part of perception. Well, if we're aware of the limits of our perception, this awareness can create a sensuality that is true. And what is this sensuality? This sense that our individual subjectivity contributes to overall reality, to the objective of existence. And the contribution is done through our interrelation, our interdependence with others. I'm going to skip down to the last sentence of section 130. Truth, which is supposed to be won by this logic of the perceptual process, proves to be in one and the same respect the opposite of itself, and thus to have as its essence a universality which is devoid of distinctions and determinations. Our limited perception is a contradiction, but that contradiction leads us to a truthful understanding of what's actually happening, our true selves. You may or may not be like, what is he talking about? You know, either it's me, Neil Trotter, or Hegel. Like, we gotta keep going. We gotta do the work, and we're gonna continue because it's gonna make sense. Okay, stay with me. Stay with me. This is page 80. We're in section 133. I begin at the end of the fifth line on this section. Understanding without knowing itself, therein, lets go its own way. This truth follows out its own essence, so that consciousness plays no part in its free realization, but merely looks on and simply apprehends it. To begin with, therefore, we must step into its place and be the notion, which develops and fills out what is contained in the result. It is through awareness of this completely developed object, which presents itself to consciousness as something that immediately is, that consciousness first becomes explicitly a consciousness that comprehends its object. Hegel brings up this concept called the notion, which he talks about in his lectures too. The notion is the object of reality, the objective of existence. Where are we all going as an entire existence? That's what the notion is. How do we understand what the notion is? Is it possible? Well, that's the question. I'll refer to my notes. To reach ultimate truth, which Hegel argues is a notion, the objective of existence, we must transcend perception, supersede apprehension, by becoming the notion through being, i.e., action. Okay? Keep that in mind. Our subjective action is how we transcend perception to lead us to ultimate truth. Okay, we're on page 81. This is section 136. This is the 11th from the last line of the page. The matters posited as independent directly pass over into their unity, and their unity directly unfolds its diversity. And this once again reduces itself to unity. But this movement is what is called force, capital F. One of its movements, the dispersal of the independent matters in their immediate being, is the expression of force. But force taken as that in which they have disappeared is force proper. Force which has been driven back into itself from its expression. First, however, the force which is driven back into itself must express itself. And secondly, it is still force remaining within itself in the expression, just as much as it is expression in this self-containedness. What do my notes say? Well, the act of being, capital B, experiencing the resistance to self-actualize due to perception. What is going on? Well, first we have to understand ourselves as an individual, right? We can't just throw away our individuality, right? That's a mistake too. If we're like, all that matters is the universal. Diversity is an illusion. That's a popular saying in many religions, like Hinduism. Diversity is an illusion. We're all just a oneness. But what Hegel is saying is, well, it is very important to acknowledge yourself as an individual, acknowledge your subjectivity. But you have to acknowledge your subjectivity in relation to the universal and acknowledge it as a contribution. Now you're going to get resistance because because ultimately diversity is an illusion, right? So being a subjective individual is a contradiction to the reality that diversity is an illusion. However, your subjectivity does matter. It does contribute to that reality of universality or universality. We'll elaborate further on this whole concept. And we first got to understand what Hegel means by contradiction. Okay, when Hegel says contradiction, he's talking about something, much deeper, much richer, much fuller than, the definition of contradiction that you find in a dictionary. He's talking about an opposing force that is necessary to actualize or be. So, if you look up contradiction in a dictionary, it's something that opposes something else and in that way nullifies or discounts that original thing that is being opposed. But when Hegel talks about contradiction, he's saying that opposition does not nullify or discount what's being opposed. Actually, the opposition is what actualizes what's being opposed, right? Meaning the contradiction is necessary for the actualization to transpire. What type of sense does this make? Well, we'll try to explain it because Hegel comes up with this concept in this work. He calls it the inverted world. And I think the inverted world is a great explanation of how he talks about contradiction. Okay. The inverted world is this kind of inverse world, inverse, kind of like a bizarro world where everything is opposite from everything else. And, it's something that he constructed, although in his mind it's not like a fiction, it's an actual real thing. It's this ideal that exists in the ideal space. It has to exist for things to actualize, to be. A contradiction is necessary. Let me read. This is section 156, page 95. Thus, this change is not yet a change of the thing itself, but rather presents itself as pure change, by the very fact that the content of the moments of change remains the same. But since the notion, qua notion of the understanding, is the same as the inner being of things, this change becomes for the understanding the law of the inner world. The understanding thus learns that it is a law of appearance itself, that differences arise which are no differences, or that what is self-same repels itself from itself, and similarly that the differences are only such as are in reality no differences, and which cancel themselves. In other words, what is not self-same is self-attractive, and thus we have a second law whose content is the opposite of what was previously called law, viz., difference for which remains constantly self-same. For this new law expresses rather that like becomes unlike, and unlike becomes like. I'll just keep reading. This is section 158. According then to the law of this inverted world, what is like in the first world is unlike to itself, and what is unlike in the first world is equally unlike to itself, or it becomes like itself. I skipped down 10 lines. We're on page 97 in case you're following. In another sphere, revenge on an enemy is, according to the immediate law, the supreme satisfaction of the injured individuality. This law, however, which bids me confront him as himself, a person who does not treat me as such, and in fact bids me destroy him as an individuality, this law is turned round by the principle of the other world into its opposite, the reinstatement of myself as a person through the destruction of the alien individuality is turned into self-destruction. Okay, he's talking about how the individuality is destroyed and becomes universal, which is true. This contradiction is necessary to reach the truth. Okay. If now this inversion, which finds expression in the punishment of crime, is made into a law, it too again is only the law of one world which is confronted by an inverted supersensible world, where what is despised in the former is honored, and what is in the former is honored meets with contempt. The punishment which under the law of the first world disgraces and destroys a man is transformed in its inverted world into the pardon which preserves his essential being and brings him to honor. Looked at superficially, this inverted world is the opposite of the first in the sense that it has the latter outside of it and repels the world from itself as an inverted actual world. That the one is appearance, but the other the in itself. That the one is the world as it is for an other, whereas the other is the world for it is for itself. It is the opposition of what we believe to be true that allows us to grow or to reach the notion, the objective reality. I'm going to continue. This is page 98 on the second line. An action, which in the world of appearance is a crime, would, in the inner world, be capable of being really good. A bad action may be well-intentioned. Punishment is punishment only in the world of appearance. In itself, or in another world, it may be a benefit for the criminal. But such antithesis of inner and outer, of appearance and supersensible, as of two different kinds of actuality, we no longer find here. The repelled differences are not shared afresh between two substances, such as would support them and lend them a separate subsistence. So this conception of contradiction is not as simple as just two opposites. It's deeper than that. It's a becoming through opposition. Okay, and it's a understanding or a comprehension or an actualization, a realization through opposition. Okay, I'm skipping down. We're still on page 98. This is the 14th line from the last. The actual crime, however, has its inversion and its in itself as possibility in the intention as such, but not in a good intention. For the truth of intention is only the act itself. But the crime, as regards its content, has its reflection into self, or its inversion, in the actual punishment. This is the reconciliation of the law, with the actuality opposed to it in the crime. Finally, the actual punishment has its inverted actuality present in it in such a way that the punishment is an actualization of the law, whereby the activity exercised by the law as punishment suspends itself and from being active. The law becomes again quiescent and is vindicated, and the conflict of individuality with it and of it with individuality is extinguished. So I refer to my notes here. The contradiction opposes the actuality, right? Inverting the actuality into something different. And that inversion is necessary for reality to reach its objective, the notion. I'll continue. From the idea then of inversion, which constitutes the essential nature of one aspect of the supersensible world, we must eliminate the sensuous idea of fixing the differences in a different sustaining element, and this absolute notion of the difference must be represented and understood purely as inner difference, a repulsion of the self-same as self-same from itself, a likeness of the unlike as unlike. We have to think pure change, or think antithesis within the antithesis itself, or contradiction. For in the difference, which is an inner difference, the opposite is not merely one of two. If it were, it would simply be, without being an opposite, but it is the opposite of an opposite, or the other is itself immediately present in it. I remember I was having a conversation with somebody, or it was with a group of people, and they're like, well, what do you think God is? One person said, oh, I think God is change, which I believe she quoted from the science fiction writer Octavia Butler. God is change. That super concept, right? The ultimate is change. It's got as much like what's being said here with Hegel, this inverted world, where a change is a divine change, like a profound change is what reality is. But how does the change happen? How is change happening? What's the process of it? Change happens through contradiction, this kind of subjectivity being opposed by a universality, and it's through this opposition that both the subject and the universal, the objective, actualize. That's how this profound change happens. So the contradiction is necessary. There's this inverted world that's happening, but a lot of people get stuck in the inverted world and they don't come out of it, right? They don't realize the contradiction for what it is, and they get stuck in the subjectivity of it and never accept the universal reality that their subjectivity is contributing toward. So how is this happening? Well, it happens when people get caught up in othering. Okay? This is page 105. We're in section 167, and I begin on the 12th line of the page. Self-consciousness is the reflection out of the being of the world of sense and perception, and is essentially the return from otherness. I skip down 15 lines. This antithesis of its appearance and its truth has, however, for its essence, only the truth, viz. The unity of self-consciousness with itself. This unity must become essential to self-consciousness, i.e., self-consciousness is desire in general. Consciousness as self-consciousness, henceforth, has a double objective. One is the immediate object, that of sense certainty and perception, which, however, for self-consciousness, has the character of a negative, and the second, viz., itself, which is the true essence, and is present in the first instance, only as opposed to the first object. In this sphere, self-consciousness exhibits itself as the movement in which this antithesis is removed, and the identity of itself with itself becomes explicit for it. What's being said here? I put in my notes. The contradiction, the self who is other, conforming to normality, is consciousness. When we reject our subjectivity, so that's another important thing. And not only is it incorrect to ignore the universal, but it's also incorrect to ignore the individual, ourselves. And this is all happening within us. Right? This is what Hegel's talking about. By rejecting who you are as an individual, your subjectivity, you also get caught up in that trap. Because how then can you use your subjectivity to contribute toward the notion? Page 106, the third line. Through this reflection into itself, the object has become life. What self-consciousness distinguishes from itself as having being also has in it, insofar as it is posited as being, not merely the character of sense certainty and perception, but it is being that is reflected into itself. And the object of immediate desire is a living thing. Okay, now we're on page 107. This is section 107, the 6th line. This being for self is really no less immediately their reflection than this unity is the splitting up into independent shapes. The unity is divided within itself because it is an absolutely negative or infinite unity. This independence of the shape appears as something determinate for an other, for the shape is divided within itself, and the supersession of this dividedness accordingly takes place through an other. But this supersession is just as much within the shape itself, for it is just that flux that is the substance of the independent shapes. This substance, however, is infinite, and hence the shape in its very subsistence is dividedness within itself, or the suppression of its being for self. I skip down 3 lines. The suppression of what direption is in itself, viz., that the shapes have no being in themselves, no enduring existence. Let me consult my notes. We conform indefinitely to avoid the other. It doesn't have to be this way, right? So not only do we other others, xenophobia for instance, but we other ourselves. We confront our true nature, and then we look at the universal society and we're like, oh, that's not what society wants us to be. What that is, what my true nature is, that's something else. That's not who I am, but it actually is who you are, right? And Who you are is what's needed to contribute to the objective of reality. And by you denying your true self or othering yourself, you put yourself in despair, right? You are not understanding your contribution to the notion. We're on page 108. This is line 8. The essence of the individual shape, universal life, and what exists for itself is in itself simple substance. When this substance places the other within itself, it supersedes this, its simplicity or its essence, i.e., it divides it, and this dividedness of the differenceless fluid medium is just what establishes individuality. Thus, the simple substance of life is the splitting up of itself into shapes, and at the same time the dissolution of these existent differences. And then I skip down to the last sentence of this section 107. Life consists rather in being the self-developing whole which dissolves its development and in this movement simply preserves itself. And that, my friends, is what the notion is. It is a self-developing of a subject that dissolves its development within itself to itself, right? Itself being the universal. Let me keep rolling here. We're on page 111. Okay, now we're on the section which is very popular in the phenomenology. It's called the Lord Bondsman Dialectic, or also called the master-slave dialectic. You know, some people refer to it like that, although it has been said that it's more appropriate rather than to use the word master-slave, which is kind of more wow factor. Saying Lord and bondsman is more direct or more applicable to what Hegel was actually referring to. But I would say like actually master-slave does refer to what is being said here. Remember, this is all happening within oneself. This is what Hegel is talking about, the consciousness, the spirit. Okay, so this is a master-slave dialectic within oneself, or the Lord Bondsman. Okay, so this is section 178. Self-consciousness exists in and for itself when and by the fact that it so exists for another. That is, it exists only in being acknowledged. So let me give you my notes. This is how we are conditioned. However, we can break free from this state. We're conditioned to believe that we exist only for others. And that's the trap we can get caught up in, and we don't exist for ourselves at all. Or we only exist for ourselves and everybody else be damned. That's another trap. But what Hegel is saying, it's both. It's both. There's a contradiction that resolves itself. We exist for everybody else by existing for ourselves. Or we exist for ourselves by existing for everybody else. Understand? The trap is when we get caught up in this master-slave dynamic. It's either I'm the master or I'm the slave, right? Or I'm the Lord or I'm the bondsman. It's either or, but that's not true. That doesn't even exist. But let me read you section 179. Self-consciousness has lost itself, for it finds itself as an other being. Secondly, in doing so, it has superseded the other, for it does not see the other as an essential being, but in the other sees its own self. Okay? That's exactly what I was talking about. The act of othering alienates oneself. Okay? Either othering others or othering yourself. You're alienating yourself from the notion, existence. I skipped down 3 lines. For it must proceed to supersede the other independent being in order thereby to become certain of itself as the essential being. Secondly, in so doing, it proceeds to supersede its own self, for this other is itself. Now we're on section 183, page 112. Thus, the action has a double significance, not only because it is directed against itself, as well as against the other, but also because it is indivisibly the action of one as well as the other. In this movement, we see repeated the process which presented itself as the play of forces, but repeated now in consciousness. This is how othering actually works. Let me skip to the last sentence of section 184. They recognize themselves as mutually recognizing one another. We have now to see how the process of this pure notion of recognition of the duplicating of self-consciousness in its oneness appears to self-consciousness. At first, it will exhibit the side of the inequality of the two, or the splitting up of the middle term into the extremes, which as extremes are opposed to one another, one being only recognized, the other only recognizing. Okay, so let me reiterate what I said before. The whole idea, like, look, this is a dog-eat-dog world. You worry about yourself, and if you're not worrying about yourself, other dogs are gonna take you out. Big fish, small pond, right? Are you gonna be the winner or loser? Look, this is a world of winners and losers. Which one are you gonna be, right? This idea of that. And it's alienating, it leads us to despair, and it doesn't lead us to any kind of fulfillment or happiness, true fulfillment, true happiness. This is this master-slave dialectic that is happening in our minds. It's something that is a falsehood that we have to reconcile. We're on section 186, page 113. This is the 20th line of the page. Each is indeed certain of its own self, but not of the other, and therefore its own self-certainty still has no truth, for it would have truth only if its own being for self had confronted it as an independent object, or what is the same thing, if the object had presented itself as its pure self-certainty. But according to the notion of recognition, this is possible only when each is for the other what the other is for it. Only when each in its own self, through its own action, and again through the action of the other, achieves this pure abstraction of being for self. Let me read you my notes. To break from the master-slave dialectic, we must acknowledge true reality as ecology. We all exist for each other, but we exist for each other by actualizing ourselves. This is section 187. This presentation of itself, however, as a pure abstraction of self-consciousness, consists in showing itself as the pure negation of its objective mode, or in showing that it is not attached to any specific existence, not to the individuality common to existence as such, that it is not attached to life. This presentation is a twofold action. Action on the part of the other and action on its own part. Insofar as it is the action of the other, each seeks the death of the other. But in so doing so, the second kind of action, action on its own part, is also involved, for the former involves the staking of its own life. My notes: by not acknowledging others as ourselves, we deny ourselves because we deny truth. It's either it's me or it's this other person or it's this other thing. We got to make a decision here. But no, there is no decision in reality. You are the other person, because the reality is you are interconnected with that other person. And by rejecting that other person, you reject your interconnectivity. And at the end of the day, what we are is our interconnectivity with everything around us. That's the truth. So we're on page 114. This is the last sentence of section 187. The other is an immediate consciousness, entangled in a variety of relationships, and it must regard its otherness as a pure being for self, or as an absolute negation. Let me go to page 115, section 189. This is the 8th line of the page. There is posited a pure self-consciousness, and a consciousness which is not purely for itself, but for another, i.e., is a merely immediate consciousness, or consciousness in the form of thinghood. Both moments are essential, since to begin with they are unequal and opposed, and their reflection into a unity has not yet been achieved. They exist as two opposed shapes of consciousness. One is the independent consciousness whose essential nature is to be for itself. The other is the dependent consciousness whose essential nature is simply to live or to be for another. The former is Lord, the other is Bondsman. Let me refer to my notes. Collective consensual subjectivity rather than objectifying each other for ourselves. Okay, look, that's important. Collective consensual subjectivity, that's my words. Rather than objectifying each other for ourselves, which is false. Collective consensual subjectivity, that's the true nature of being, right? That's how the notion actualizes. That is the force with capital F, as Hegel is talking about. And I will read you some more of my notes. We got it all wrong. We all must exist for each other, but not as each other's things, right? But rather as subjects of ourselves for each other. You know, I'm going to keep saying that because it's very important. Acknowledging the subject, the individual, and the object, the universal. Our individual relationship with everything else, the ecology. Okay, here we are on page 121, and this is section 200. It is true that for this self-consciousness, the essence is neither an other than itself, nor the pure abstraction of the I, but an I which has the otherness within itself, though in the form of thought, so that in its otherness it has directly returned into itself. Okay, this ultimate understanding, this true understanding, is realizing that subjective individuality is objective existence. Okay, they're the same. You know, one causes the other, and the other causes the one. You know, it's this contradiction that actualizes itself as one. So now we're on page 133. This is section 220. If consciousness were aware of being an independent consciousness, and the world of actuality were for it an absolute nullity, then in work and enjoyment it would attain to a feeling of its independence, since the world of actuality would be nullified by itself. But since this actuality is for consciousness the form of the unchangeable, it is unable of itself to nullify it. On the contrary, since it does succeed in setting it at naught and enjoying it, this comes about through the unchangeable's itself having surrendered its embodied form and having relinquished it for the enjoyment of consciousness. Consciousness, on its part, likewise, makes its appearance as an actuality, but also as divided within itself. And in its work and enjoyment, this dividedness displays itself as breaking up into a relation to the world of actuality, or a being which is for itself, and into a being that is in itself. The relation to actuality is the changing of it, or working on it, the being for self, which belongs to the individual consciousness as such. But in this relation, it is also in itself, or has intrinsic being. This aspect belongs to the unchangeable beyond and consists of faculties and powers, a gift from an alien source, which the unchangeable makes over to consciousness to make use of. What's that all about? I consult my notes. Our individual consciousnesses, plural, can strive together to develop overall consciousness, meaning our individual truths create a diversity which manifests as ultimate reality. It is our diversity, right, which unifies into an ultimate reality. But that diversity is necessary for that unification to happen, right? So it's a contradiction, but the contradiction doesn't nullify or invalidate either or, right? Rather, the contradiction validates both because they're part of the process. Now I'm going to read from page 185, and this is section 310. The individual exists in and for himself. You know what? Yes, let's use universal language. I'm going to use they, them pronouns. I'm getting Hegelian, even though Hegel, the individual exists in and for themselves. There are for themselves or is a free activity, but they has also an intrinsic being or has an original determinate being of their own. A determinateness which in principle the same as what psychology thought to find outside of them, in their own self. Therefore, there emerges the antithesis, this duality of being, the movement of consciousness, and the fixed being of an appearing actuality. An actuality which, in the individual, is immediately their own. This being the body of the specific individual is the latter's original aspect, that aspect in the making of which it has not itself played a part. But since the individual is at the same time only what they have done, their body is also the expression of themselves, which they have themselves produced. It is at the same time a sign which has not remained an immediate fact, but something through which the individual only makes known what they really are when they set their original nature to work. And I consult my notes. A person is a becoming. They are how they start and what they must move to. They are a self-actualization by transcendence. This is what being is, capital B. This is how subjective objectivity plays out. Right? This is how the contradiction resolves itself. We're on page 206, the 19th line on this page. This is section 340. This essential nature of its own self is not explicitly present to it. On the contrary, it places it beyond itself. By this alienation, it creates for itself the possibility of a higher existence. If only it could take back again into itself its alienated object, then if it had remained undisturbed within the immediacy of being, because spirit is all the greater the opposition from which it has returned into itself, but it creates this opposition for itself by setting aside its immediate unity and by alienating its being for self. However, if such a consciousness does not reflect on itself, the intermediate position or middle term which it occupies is an unhappy void, since what should fill and fulfill it has been turned into a fixed extreme. Thus, it is this final stage of reason in its observational role is its worst, and that is why its reversal becomes a necessity. So again, what's being said here is what we talked about before, about how it's important for the individual to self-actualize, to understand their true essence, their true nature, their true being, to not be othered, right? To figure out their subjectivity. And then after that, there's a need for the subject to understand how they can contribute to the objective of existence, the notion, right? And that contribution has to be made through their subjectivity. But we're talking about their true nature. They can't alienate themselves, or they can't other themselves to conform to a universal reality without first understanding their true self. Without making that connection, one will likely fall into despair. So now we're on page 207. The 6th line down, this is section 341. The unitary being, qua, a being for itself or negative being, stands in antithesis to the universal, draws away from it, and remains free for itself, so that the notion being realized only in the element of absolute singleness and isolation does not find in organic existence its true expression. viz. To be present as a universal, but remains as an outer or what is the same thing, an inner of organic nature. The organic process is only implicitly free, but is not explicitly free for itself. The being for self of its freedom appears in purpose and exists as another being, as wisdom that is conscious of itself and is outside of the process. Reason, in the role of observer, thus turns to this wisdom, turns to spirit, to the notion, existing as a universality, or to purpose existing as purpose, and henceforth the object before it is its own essence. And my notes say, the spirit is subjectivity, being without objectivity, individual without universal. Now let me read you this log block. Section 352, page 214. This is important. I'll read you this. It is a present living spirit in which the individual not only finds their essential character, i.e., their universal and particular nature expressed and present to them in the form of thinghood, but is themselves this essence, and also has realized that essential character. The wisest men of antiquity have therefore declared that wisdom and virtue consist in living in accordance with the customs of one's nation, conforming to society, right? But from this happy state of having realized its essential character and of living in it, self-consciousness, which at first is spirit, only immediately and in principle has withdrawn or else has not yet realized it. For both may equally well be said. Reason must withdraw from this happy state, for the life of a free people is only in principle or immediately the reality of an ethical order. In other words, the ethical order exists merely as something given. Therefore, this universal spirit itself is a separate individual spirit, and the customs and laws in their entirety are a specific ethical substance, which only in the higher stage, viz., in spirit's consciousness of its essence, shares its limitation and in this knowledge alone has its absolute truth, not directly as it immediately is. In the latter form, it is a limited ethical substance. An absolute limitation is just this, that spirit in the form of mere being. Further, therefore, the single individual consciousness as it exists immediately in the real ethical order in the nation is a solid, unshakable trust in which spirit has not, for the individual, resolved itself into its abstract moments, and therefore he is not aware of himself as being a pure individuality on his own account. But once, and therefore, they are not aware of themselves as being a pure individuality on their own account. But once they have arrived at this idea, as they must, then this immediate unity with spirit, the mere being of themselves in spirit, their trust is lost, isolated on their own. It is they who are now the essence, no longer universal spirit. This individuality of self-consciousness is, it is true, a moment of universal spirit itself, but only as a vanishing quantity which, appearing on its own, is at once resolved within a universal spirit and enters consciousness merely as trust. In this establishing themselves, and each moment, because it is a moment of the essence, must succeed in exhibiting itself as essence. The individual has thereby placed themselves in opposition to the laws and customs. These are regarded as mere ideas having no absolute essentiality, an abstract theory without any reality, while they, as this particular I, is their own living truth. Okay, I'll read you my notes. The true essence of an individual cannot reconcile with the reality of constructed universal. Okay, constructed universal is, social constructs, essentially, that disregard people's actual subjectivity, right? I'm talking about like xenophobia, homophobia, right? Racism, right? Denying who people really are and how they relate to existence as a whole, throwing that all out and saying like, look, this is society as it is, you either conform to it or you're another. Not only does that block the person being othered, but it also blocks the universal. The society cannot move forward or progress or be constructive in like a spiritual sense. Phenomenology of spirit cannot happen because there's an othering going on. The contradiction has not resolved itself. It hasn't worked itself out. Let me skip down 7 lines. We're on page 356. It is the practical consciousness which steps into its world, which it finds already given, with the aim of duplicating itself in this distinct form of something separate and individual, of producing itself as this individual, as this existent counterpart of itself, and of becoming conscious of this unity of its own actuality with the objective being of the world. Self-consciousness has the certainty of this unity. It holds that the unity is implicitly already present, or that this agreement of itself with thinghood already exists and has only to become, so far, it through its own agency, or that the production of that unity is equally the finding of it. Since this unity means happiness, the individual is sent out into the world by his own spirit to seek his happiness. If then, for us, the truth of this rational self-consciousness is the ethical substance here, for that self-consciousness, it is the beginning of its ethical experience of the world. Okay, I'll read you my notes. Happiness occurs when the truth of the individual reconciles with the universal, right? When the contradiction works itself out and actualizes. This is page 217, section 359. We're on the 4th line on the page. The individual cannot preserve themselves, but rather that the good can only be accomplished through the sacrifice of the individual. And self-consciousness becomes virtue. What virtue learns from experience can only be this, that its end is already attained in principle, that happiness is found directly in the action itself, and that action itself is the good. The notion or principle of this entire sphere, viz., that thinghood is spirit's very being for itself, becomes the course of this experience a truth for self-consciousness. Having discovered this, self-consciousness thus knows itself to be reality in the form of an individuality that directly expresses itself, an individuality which no longer encounters resistance from an actual world opposed to it, and whose aim and object are only this expressing of itself. Let me read you my notes. True virtue is society sacrificing its individuality for individuals who then express their beings for society. Okay, so society serves the individual, and the individual serves society, and they complement each other. This is the last sentence of page 223, section 372. For the individual's act is supposed to be the act of their particular heart, not a free universal reality, and at the same time, they have in fact recognized the latter, for their action has the significance of positing their essential being as a free reality, i.e. of acknowledging the real world to be their own essential being. So being, capital B, is the individual universalized as individual. It is a subjective objectification. This is page 229. Starting on the 12th line, section 381. Individuality is really what has to be nullified, but this nullifying of individuality merely makes room, as it were, for the in itself of the way of the world to enter into existence on its own account. The general content of the actual way of the world we already know. Looked at more closely, it is again nothing else but the 2 preceding moments of self-consciousness. So it's not that you're getting rid of the individual, rather you're just an understanding of the individual as a subject within the universal. It's understanding the ecology of reality, the interdependent relationship of the individual with everything else. All you're doing in terms of the phenomenology of spirit is giving up the idea that the individual is independent of the universal, but you're not sacrificing your individuality. So this is page 245. We're on section 408. The 10th line of the page, I begin. The necessity of the action consists in the fact that purpose is related simply to actuality. And this unity is the notion of action. Action takes place because action is in and for itself the essence of actuality. In the work, it is true, there is revealed the contingency possessed by achievement when contrasted with willing and doing. And this experience, which seems as if it must be accepted as truth, contradicts that notion of action. If, however, we consider the content of this experience in its completeness, it is seen to be the vanishing work. What is preserved is not the vanishing. The vanishing is itself actual and is bound up with the work and vanishes with it. The negative itself perishes along with the positive, whose negative it is. The vanishing of the vanishing lies in the notion of the intrinsically real individuality itself. For that in which the work vanishes or that vanishes in the work and what was supposed to give experience, as it was called, its supremacy over individuality, own notion of itself, is the objective reality. Objective reality, however, is a moment which itself no longer possesses any truth on its own account in this consciousness. That truth consists solely in the unity of this consciousness with the action, and the true work is only that unity of doing and being, of willing and achieving. So what is the true meaning of life? What is the objective of existence? What Hegel is saying is, look, what it is not what's important. What's important is the acting out of going toward whatever that is, okay? And the acting out, the being of it is self-actualization, coming to true terms with who you are as an individual, then understanding how that individuality, how your true self can contribute to society, to the world, to existence, to help make the world a better place, right? i.e., helping reality reach its ultimate objective. Action, right? Not understanding, action. That's the truth, right? That's the ultimate truth, is our acting, is not our understanding. This is page 246. Second line. Consciousness is reflected out of its perishable work into itself, and preserves its notion and its certainty as what objectively exists and endures in face of the experience of the contingency of action. It experiences, in point of fact, its notion, in which reality is only a moment, i.e., something for consciousness, not something which exists in its own right. Its experiences it as a vanishing moment, and reality therefore has for consciousness only the value of being, as such, whose universality is one with action. This unity is the true work. It is the very heart of the matter, which completely holds its own and its experience as that which endures, independently of what is merely the contingent result of an individual action. The result of contingent circumstances, means, and reality. Individual action within universal context is constructive existence, right? That is the notion. That is the being, capital B. Let me read you, this is from page 250. This is section 417. This is the 15th line from the last of that page. Since it now turns out that its own action and effort, the play of its own powers, is the heart of the matter, it seems that consciousness is occupied with its own interests. not with that of others, and is anxious only about action as its own action, not about action as the action of others, and hence seems to allow the others to do as they like about the matter they have in hand. But again, they are mistaken. That consciousness has already left the position they thought it occupied. It is not concerned with the matter in hand as its own particular affair, but simply as a matter in hand, as a universal which is for everyone. One's action is the action of others. Right? Once we realize that, that's when we start to figure out, okay, this is truth, this is happiness, like this is where we need to be. But we're on page 251 now. I begin on the 8th line. They pretend that their action and efforts are something for themselves alone, in which they have not only themselves in their own essential nature in mind. I skip down 4 lines. Actualization is, on the contrary, a display of what is one's own in the element of universality, whereby it becomes and should become the affair of everyone. Okay, now we're on the last sentence of page 251. Being is the action of the single individual and of all individuals, and whose action is immediately for others, or is a matter in hand, and is such only as the action of each and everyone, the essence which is the essence of all beings, viz. Spiritual essence. Preach, Hegel, preach. Let me skip down 6 lines. Thus, the matter it had no longer has the character of a predicate and loses the characteristic of lifeless universality. It is rather substance, permeated by individuality, subject in which there is individuality just as much qua individual or qua this particular individual as qua all individuals, and it is the universal which has being only as this action of all and each, and a reality in the fact that this particular consciousness knows it to be its own individual reality and the reality of all. And my notes say, the individual does not lose meaning because of the collective. Rather, the collective's need for the individual or individuality manifests meaning for the individual. We derive meaning from the collective, from the universal, from society. But society derives meaning from the individual, from us, from our contribution. But we have to be true to ourselves before we can be true to others, which the others are ourselves. So, I will stop here. I've only scratched the surface, even though this video is now hella long. But, you know, it's a complex, in-depth book, right, that has a lot of ideas. And what I was focused on is an idea, or concepts, or series of concepts and themes that we can apply to today's society to make the world better. We got to stop othering each other. You know, but we also got to stop rejecting our true reality, our true nature, in the service of this constructed universal reality that's false. We look at societies today, and only certain subjects are permitted. You know, most subjects are rejected, right? Only a certain kind. But by rejecting all the subjects, right, all the individuals that can contribute to the universal, and you know, what are we talking about here? Sexism, homophobia, xenophobia, racism, transphobia, Islamophobia. I mean, the list goes on and on. All the isms, all the phobias. We're denying all those true selves, people who are truly who they are and can contribute much to the universal, but we reject them as a society. Got to stop doing that. We got to allow ourselves to accept each other for who we are, and then allow their acceptance to help us grow as a society, as a universal, as an existence. That's what being is, with a capital B. And by doing that, reality will further reach its objective, which Hegel calls the notion. It's a masterwork for sure. and don't be deceived. You might pick it up and read it and be like, wow, this is so outdated, this is so complex, this is so old. This has a lot to say about the world today. It is timeless, and it's got a lot of advice. I didn't even scratch the surface. There's so much other things said in this book, it's crazy. So if you want to, I encourage you, try it. Try reading it. And if it's too much, try some of Hegel's other works and build yourself up. I recommend his lectures. His lectures on the history of philosophy and the philosophy of history. Great starting points, but don't be afraid. Check it out. Well, you've been watching The Black Ponderer. Tune in next time for more philosophical thought.